Hi everyone. For our topic this week, I've actually split it into two chunks to make it kind of a bit more consumable. Really, what we're examining, though, as our kind of broader concept is how do humans make meaning, right? So, how do we kind of understand the world around us? We've looked at how humans structure and organize the world, but now we're looking at it at kind of more of that kind of cognitive level. How do we think about the world around us? How do we understand what happens in the world around us? And then, how do we interact with each other in ways that create meaning for us and that unite us and bring us together? So the first part we're going to do, what I'm going to cover in this video, is symbolic practices, symbols, more specifically, and then we're going to look at one of my favorite topics and one of my own kind of areas of research interest, which is the body and body modifications and how our body, how we modify it and kind of construct our bodies and shape our bodies and understand our bodies from our own cultural lenses. And then our next topic, which will be in the next video, is looking at what most of you might think of when you think about things like worldview and ideologies, is looking at religions and ritual. And we're going to touch on rites of passage, which I introduced to you folks last week in our topic on marriage and kinship. So if we want to understand what worldviews are, we need to start actually with one of the core concepts of it relating to symbolic thought and symbolic practices. And this kind of links into this broader question of, well, how do we learn about culture as anthropologists? But also, how do we learn about culture as humans within a society? Now, next week's topic, we're going to have a guest lecture by one of my colleagues who's a linguistic anthropologist who's going to talk about language and linguistic anthropology and communication. And that's a really key way in which we communicate information about our cultures and learn about our cultures. But I want to think kind of more broadly and just thinking about these two major processes about how we learn about our world, because it's not simply about learning about our world, but it's learning how to learn, how to think, how to interpret what is around us, and also the appropriate ways of acting in a culture as well. And so the two major learning processes that relate to culture are socialization and enculturation. So socialization is where we're learning the skills that we need to successfully interact with other members of the groups that we belong to. And so this is a really relevant thing about socialization, because I think the different generational differences we see in response to, for example, mask mandates is a good example of us being a product of our socialization, right? So how much space do we give each other in line? How close is it appropriate to stand next to someone else? And what we see cross-culturally is there's a whole bunch of different rules around these kind of skills, right? Around these kind of rules that relate to how we act as members in a group, right? And how do we become a member of a group, and how do we remain a member of that group? Enculturation, on the other hand, is the ways of thinking and feeling, right? How we learn how to kind of behave and think as a member of a group, right? And importantly, it's what is considered to be appropriate ways of thinking and feeling in our own respective cultures. And we talked about this previously when we talked about things like sexuality, right? That our understanding of our own sexualities is often shaped by our cultural understanding of what is and is not permissible sexual behavior. And socialization and enculturation then result in our worldview, right? The ways in which we think about the world, we learn about the world around us, and come to understand it. So how do we then understand these kind of variations in cultures is recognizing first and foremost that culture is symbolic. And you remember that this is one of the key traits of culture. And it's because symbols are the ways in which we organize our knowledge, our learning, our worldview, right? Everyone uses symbols. And indeed, some of us make the argument, even within anthropology, that it's our capacity for symbolic thought, symbolic behavior, and the use of symbols that distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom, right? And again, this is something we can talk a little bit more in depth in terms of language and communication, but this is something critical to think about, right? Is, well, what are symbols then? Well, symbols are simply something, a word, an image, an action, a gesture that stands for something else, right? So and we're going to talk about the different functions then that symbols play, right? That symbols can, oops, sorry, I don't know what's going on here, can mirror the world around us. They can represent the world. or they can be non-representative of the world, right? They can capture things that do not exist, things that may not ever come to exist. And this is something kind of unique that we can do as humans, right? We can talk about things that happen in the past and in the present. Again, we can have fictive worlds that we can create and symbols that we can create that can take on new and different meanings. So how then do anthropologists approach symbols? Well, through a number of different ways. So Sherry Ortner talks about how we can just simply understand symbols by classifying them into these two different groups. So she uses summarizing symbols and elaborating symbols. And I have this down here in the notes below, but summarizing symbols are those symbols that are used to kind of represent a whole, as it were, right? And so a flag is a good example of that. The Canadian flag is meant to capture and represent who we are as a nation, who we are as a state, and then who we are as a people, as a culture, right? It represents a lot of our identity and again, our ideology, our worldview of who we think we are in the world at play. And the context in the Olympics right now, I think, is a good example of this, that there's a lot of summarizing symbols that are used by nations to represent their identities and the uniqueness of those identities. Elaborating symbols, on the other hand, are those which attempt to allow us to understand our world better, right? So it's kind of organizing principles around this. And the example I believe your textbook uses around the Dinka and cattle, that cattle are simply more than just a symbol for the Dinka people, but indeed the cattle and how they understand cattle, how they treat cattle, how cattle are used in their society in terms of economic and political and social organization is very intricately connected with cattle. And cattle itself can be a symbol for the worldview as well. Different parts of the cattle represent different understandings of the universe and the world around them. Right? Another key concept around symbols is the idea of schemas, because symbols and schemas can kind of overlap, but not necessarily so. So for example, if I were to draw an image, and I'll do this further in class for you, an image of a tree. And so right now in your head, you're picturing a tree. Maybe it's a drawing of a tree. Maybe it's a tree that you can see out your window. Maybe it's a favorite tree that you have. Maybe it's a stylized representation of a tree, right? And we can or it's the word tree, right? And we can recognize that, right? And specify what kind of tree. It could be a palm tree or a pine tree or a whole bunch of different types of tree, right? A schema, on the other hand, and an example of a schema would be something like a Christmas tree. It's not just a tree, right? But there's a patterning of elements around it, right? So there would be certain attributes that we would expect the tree to have, right? A palm tree isn't our standard default idea of what, or of a symbol or representative of Christmas, right? We think more of a pine tree with its like triangular shape, right, and its little branches. But it's not just simply the tree, right? It's the presents, it's the lights, it's the decorations, it's the time of the year, right? And so this represents then a schema, right? So we have this patterning of elements or symbols that build a picture or an understanding or representative of, again, a core concept or an idea. The problem with symbols, though, is that they're highly dependent on context and on culture, right? So what might be a meaningful symbol in one community could be a problematic one in another context. So, I mean, as you know, I both hate, but also frequently do bring in real world events into the classroom and politics. And if we think about, for example, the swastika, right? The history of the swastika is one that is extremely complicated because it does not mean the same thing to all peoples. And indeed, nor is the swastika even represented in the same kind of way, with the directionality, for example, varies depending on which particular cultural group is utilizing it as a symbol. And of course, it can be used as a symbol for prosperity and wealth, or unfortunately, in the contemporary context we see being used right now here in Canada, is that it's a hate symbol, right? And it's one that signals racism and discrimination and beliefs of certain people basically against the rights and well-being and wellness and validity of other identities that are out there, right? So this means that they can be challenging to interpret. And as an archaeologist, I think about this all the time, because in some cases, if we don't have a lot of, again, information or context about a symbol, it can be really hard to interpret it. So in class, we can talk about this symbol, a symbol that might be familiar to many of you, but one that is common in a certain part of the world in archaeological sites. And so our understanding of what the symbol is and what it means is something that has developed over the years as we've understood the different contexts it appears, as we've read texts that talk about this symbol and what it means, right? And so actually this understanding of symbols, we refer to as semiotics or semiotics in not just anthropology, but just more broadly in academia. Now, how I like to approach the study of symbols is to look at some of the different ways that anthropologists have studied them, right? And so one of the best ways to understand them is to look at things like their function, to look at their context, and look at some of the different ways symbols are used in our societies, and art is an excellent way to get at this. But then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is art? What is the purpose of art? What is the function of art? What is the meaning of different kind of artistic works? And indeed, we have debates even in our own society of what art is. And so this is a bit of a throwback to one of my daughter's past loves. And we spent quite a few years wrapped up in My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. Both madness and the magic that's around it as well, right? And so we might look at the image of on the left, right, Starry Night, a very famous piece by Vincent van Gogh. We might look at the beauty of it, the significance of it. We might think about the historical context, right? And we might look at it and say, yes, this is definitely a piece of art. It's representing the world around us, but in a highly stylized way, right? Does the moon look like this? Yes, sometimes it does, but not all the time. But yet many of us look at this and we can identify this readily as a moon. Same with the housing. Just enough details are provided that we can interpret different things like houses. But is this exactly what a house looks like in the real world? No, it's representational, right? On the other hand, some people might look at My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, and say that this is not a form of art. But again, we have to think about then what are our cultural biases around what is art. And so art serves many different functions and purposes in society, that it doesn't have to necessarily represent our world, but it can represent values of our world. And again, as a little bit, I'll admit, I'm a little bit of a My Little Pony fan, Friendship is Magic. It's because the core messaging that is communicated by using these highly stylized, kind of cute ponies to talk about navigating friendship. It's a really powerful piece of work, right? Is it art? Well, that's something that we debate, right? Because it's representing some of the core values of our world, but definitely not the world that we are familiar with or that we know. Although we might represent some of the symbols of it, right? So if we think about this character here, we might make some interpretations of what her personality is like based on how she's represented, right? The hat she wears, the symbols that are present on her body, even how her hair is styled might tell us something about her identity. That's going to be what I'd like to talk about in class. So what is art? So I mentioned that art serves various functions. One of the examples of this is that art is meant to portray the world accurately, right? So that it's miming or mimicking the world around us. And here's two examples of some art representing this, right? So we have a number of women here who are doing some physical labor in a field environment, right? And this looks very similar to a photograph we might see from a particular time and place, right? If we think about the Mona Lisa, there's been a lot of debate around how accurately, the representation of this individual was. Is this truly a individual? Was this an amalgam of several individuals? Does she represent the pinnacle of beauty, or what else is captured in this image? So even when we portray the world accurately, or we may see it as being realistic, there still are these kind of, again, symbolic attributes about it. We attempt to read into the art what is present there. Again, this means that art can be representational. It can imitate, idealize, or symbolize various forms in the real world or experiences we have. And this is where in your textbook it talks about Allen's interpretation or definition of art as play with form, producing some aesthetically successful transformation representation. So then it breaks down to explain his definition. So what does he mean by play with form? Well, what artists do is that they understand and sometimes both play with and then counteract the culturally appropriate restrictions we have in terms of how play is conducted. And we can talk more about this in class on Wednesday, but also the form that material take, right? How do we organize it in time and space, right? And we can also look at how often art as play with form gets translated into something that should be under, certain forms of economies, should be something that should be commercially lucrative versus just simply representational or done for pleasure, for example, right? And then it says that it produces some aesthetically successful transformation representation. So what Alan is trying to get here is that it's this recognition that art may represent the real world, but it doesn't necessarily have to do so in a way that, again, is photorealistic or 100% accurate, right? Some of it certainly does it, but others might be more of an idealized form or might symbolically represent what is going on in the world. And I can't remember if I have some examples coming up here, but we can pull up some in class. And the reason why it calls transformation representation is that we understand that through the act of representing the world, we do so through transforming various kinds of media, right? And so if you think about sculpture, right, you might be taking stone or clay and modifying it and transforming it in order to represent an idea or a concept, right? And even though we think of like the Venus de Milo as being a representation of a beautiful female figurine, we also recognize that the material that's being used is not necessarily the material we would expect a beautiful woman to be made out of, right? It's marble, stone. So we have this understanding that, again, there's this symbolic representation that's occurring. We can also talk about style. And so this goes back to this idea schema, is that we also have an idea that there are appropriate ways of utilizing various kinds of media, right? And again, sometimes art serves to challenge these existing, again, master narratives that exist, right? Or countering, sometimes it's these, again, counter hegemonic narratives as well, right? Saying, okay, well, you expect us to use it this way, but I'm going to do something different with it. And that's what makes it art, right? And so that's what we talk about when we talk about media or medium, is that there is this aesthetic, or that there is this actual piece that is produced as a result of this work. So art can be representational, but it can also be what is called instrumental as well. Oh, sorry, I jumped forward one slide here. So what about art as instrumental? Well, some might argue that art is meant to have an impact on society itself, right? That it's meant to enrich our lives, and this could be just simply by being beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. It can be because it's teaching us some sort of moral lesson, right? So thinking about the work of Banksy, the political critique that is embedded in his work, or her work, or their work, I should say, right? Or thinking about this is an art installation. This is a forest. I believe this was taken in Manitoba. I can't remember the source of this. I should have put it here. But this is part of the red dress movement. And so each of these red dresses are meant to recognize missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, right? And draw attention to this problem that we have in Canada and have had in Canada for a significant time period, right? So it's meant to remind us of the duty and responsibility and obligation that we have to our Indigenous peoples, but also to Indigenous women and girls, and particularly those who are missing, who have been murdered, who have been forgotten, who've been lost, who've been made invisible simply because of their identity, right? So it's a very powerful political statement. And it also can sometimes provide insights for improving and changing the world as well. And again, this Banksy piece, right? I remember when all of this was trees versus a constructed building space, right? However, art doesn't have to be just one of these things. It can be representational and instrumental. Folklore is a good example of this, right? All of the different stories or ways that we have of talking about our shared history, which could be both fantastical or historical in nature, right? We think of these as being written, but they can also be transmitted orally. Cross-cultural studies, such as the work of people like Joseph Campbell, although it's a little bit problematic, but still gets the idea that there are some basic themes we see cross-culturally. Part of the reason why Star Wars, for example, resonates with so many folks is because of the work of Joseph Campbell that inspired the Star Wars saga, that inspired the hero's tale, right? Was derived from a cross-cultural study of world mythology, right? And so mythology, or myths as one example of folklore, are these kind of stories that we have that are meant to be representative of our ideas of how society should, or the world at large should operate, should be, what is right, what is wrong, right? It gives us a compass. It gives us instructions often for living as well. We also might think of art as having a certain authenticity around it, and we can talk about this in class a little bit. We'll talk about the work of Biittner and looking at various forms of authenticity out of the ethnographic work that she did, looking at musicians and reproducing traditional songs for their culture, but now using with different instruments and in a contemporary setting and in different places, and what this means. And so based on her studies, what she came up with is this understanding of authenticity. And so what I'd like you folks to do is look at these definitions and then attempt to come up with some examples, and we'll share these in class. And then the last thing we're going to talk about in class is, as I mentioned, one of my favorite topics, which is that one of the ways that I approach our understanding of our bodies and our identities is through how we modify or shape our bodies. And we might say as a form of artistic expression. It's important to note as well that our body we can think of from a number of different ways. As an archaeologist, we might see it as part of the archaeological record, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, material culture. We talked about how transplantation has made organs and certain components of our bodies a commodity. We can see how technology shape our understanding of body. Something we can talk about is cybernetics and cyborgs. It's one of my favorite topics and how that shape bodies, but also our identity through various kinds of aspects. Things we talked about previously, like sex and gender, are also ways that we both express ourselves, but also express our cultural learning and understanding. Now, for me, talking about body modifications often comes down to tattoos because this is an important part of my identity. And I was heavily influenced by the work of people like Dr. Margot de Mello, who wrote this incredible book called Bodies of Inscription. So there has been anthropological work done looking at bodies. And most of the work that's been done has shown that body modification and tattooing in particular is very strongly linked with both personal and cultural identity. And so this is what I wanted to talk with you folks a little bit more on Wednesday as well. I want to talk about the various forms of body adornment, so not just tattooing, which is a form of both permanent and temporary modification, because you can get temporary tattoos such as this from my foot and my daughter's foot when she was 2 years old. Which is adorable, but we can talk about some of these other aspects of body decoration and ornamentation. I also want to talk with you folks about cultural appropriation. I think it's really important that we make a distinction in this class that one of the values of anthropological work is an understanding of the difference between cultural appreciation and the cultural appropriation. So I want to talk about this and why cultural appropriation is wrong, is bad. And then I want to spend some time, like I said, talking with you folks about tattooing and talking about tattooing from a four-field approach. So we'll talk about Ötzi, the Iceman, which gives us some insights from archaeology and biological anthropology. We can also look at it from an archaeological perspective in terms of the technology that's used for tattooing. And then what I would like us to have a discussion on is this slide or this exercise here, is that I'd like you to consider these tattoos that I'm showing you from these individuals. And I want you to think about how we might be able to make some interpretations about their identity based on their tattoos, based on the symbols that are used, based on the placement of their body, and based on other information about these individuals we can assess that's presented in these images here. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you folks about that on Wednesday. And then after we've done that, I want to talk about and link this back into the anthropological perspective and critically the importance of holism. We're going to talk about this is about, again, how tattoos then can be linked with not just personal identity, but with group identity, with symbols of status. And I want to talk about how agency or power comes into play with that. So we can talk about how some symbols are, again, acceptable, even in tattoo form, while there are other symbols that aren't as acceptable. And then I want to give you a cross-cultural example, and I want to talk about the Maori tamoko. And this is something that's actually got a lot of attention over the last few years, just because we've seen so much greater representation of it in the media, including here outside of New Zealand or Eritrea. Sorry, I always pronounce that wrong, using the Maori name versus the colonial name. And then I wanted to link this with post-colonial context, and we can talk a little bit about how colonialism has shaped traditional cultural practices such as tattooing and body modification, and how it's become, tattooing in particular, has become a really important mechanism for cultural affirmation and cultural reclamation in, again, these post-colonial times that we live in. Okay, and so I've given a whole bunch of resources for you. Again, these are all optional resources, but we will talk about these further in class. So I look forward to having a great discussion with you folks on Wednesday. Take care until then.